On the charge of murder, we, the jury, find Mrs. Adesua not guilty.
Can you confirm whether the suspect is a member of the family?
This development has taken everyone by surprise. No one anticipated.
How could something like this happen without anyone noticing? What does this mean for trust within the family?
This is far more serious than
In
we
the
thought.
midst of all this chaos, Adesua walked out of the courtroom smiling, knowing she had finally gotten justice for her child. But Adesua remained silent, because the truth, the real truth, was not inside that courtroom. As she stepped into the corridor, the noise faded behind her, and in its place, something else began to surface. A memory, a soft laugh, Ayomide. Her daughter's voice echoed in her mind, light, carefree, full of life, the kind of laughter that filled a room and made everything feel safe. For a split second, Adesua saw her clearly, smiling, alive, untouched by pain. Then the image shifted. Rain, heavy, relentless rain hitting the ground. Darkness, a body lying still. The red spreading across the concrete, mixing with water, flowing in thin lines that disappeared into the night. And then, a face, Kunle Adeyemi. Not as the court had seen him, not as the man who stood trial, but as the man she had known, familiar, trusted, close enough to sit at her table, close enough to be called family. The memories came in pieces, sharp, fast, impossible to hold on to, and just as quickly as they appeared, they were gone. Adesua blinked. The corridor returned, but something inside her had already shifted. Because this story was never just about a courtroom. It was never just about a verdict. It was about a question that had no easy answer. How does a respected woman become a killer and walk free? How does someone go from building a life to destroying one? And more importantly, if someone destroyed your entire world, what would you do? Would you wait for justice, or would you take it into your own hands? Because the truth is, not every story ends the way it should. Not every system protects the people it promises to protect. And sometimes, the line between right and wrong becomes impossible to see. Before we go further, if you believe a mother's love has no limit, like and subscribe. Because what happened next will challenge everything you think you understand about justice, pain, and revenge. Long before the courtroom, long before the verdicts, before everything fell apart, Adesua Adeyemi was known for something else entirely: control. Her name carried weight in the quiet circles of influence across Lagos. Not the loud kind that demanded attention, but the kind that moved through rooms with quiet authority. People listened when she spoke. Deals shifted when she nodded. Invitations followed her without effort. Widowed early, she had taken what many thought would break her and turned it into power. Her late husband had left behind the structure, but it was Adesua who expanded it. She stepped into business with precision, learning quickly, adapting faster. Within a few years, she had built a reputation that stood on its own, separate from the man she once stood beside. She did not depend on sympathy. She did not wait for support. She built it, and she built well. But behind the polished image, behind the composed presence that people admired, there was only one thing that truly mattered to her. Only one place where she allowed herself to soften. Only one person who saw her not as a figure of influence, but simply as a mother. Her home stood in Ikoyi, tucked within a quiet, secure street lined with tall gates and trimmed hedges. The kind of place where privacy was expected, not requested, where silence meant safety and distance meant control. Inside, everything reflected intention. Clean lines, soft lighting, spaces designed not just for comfort, but for peace. Large windows overlooked the calm stretch of the lagoon, where the water moved slowly, undisturbed by the constant rush of the city beyond. In the evenings, the sky would fade into deep orange, and Adesua often stood there, watching the light disappear while the world outside continued its endless motion. It was a life many would describe as complete. No financial strain, no visible struggle, no lack. Drivers waited when needed. Security ensured nothing entered without permission. Every detail was managed, controlled, accounted for. From the outside, nothing could go wrong here. Nothing was supposed to. At the center of that carefully built world was Ayomide. Everything Adesua had, everything she worked for, pointed back to her. Ayomide had been raised in comfort, but not carelessness. Private schools had shaped her education, but discipline shaped her character. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that came not from wealth, but from how she had been raised. Focused, respectful, ambitious. There were plans already in motion, applications abroad, future pathways carefully discussed over dinner, opportunities lined up before most people her age even understood what they wanted. Adesua ensured that nothing was left to chance. Every fee paid early, every connection used wisely, every step mapped out. Not because she wanted control over her daughter's life, but because she wanted to protect it. Because in her mind, the more she prepared, the safer Ayomide would be. Their life together was not built only on structure. It was built on moments. Weekend mornings often began with quiet drives to Victoria Island, where they moved through high-end stores not always to buy, but simply to spend time. Ayomide would pause at displays holding up dresses asking, "What do you think?" And Adesua would answer honestly, sometimes teasing, sometimes approving, always present. On Sundays, brunch became routine. A reserved table, familiar staff, meals they didn't need to think about ordering anymore. They talked about everything there. School, plans, small frustrations, big dreams. And at night, when the world slowed down, their conversations changed. Those were the moments without structure. No plans, no schedules, just honesty. Ayomide would sit close, sometimes resting her head lightly as she spoke about her future, her fears, the pressure she sometimes felt to succeed. And Adesua would listen, not as a businesswoman, not as someone respected, but as a mother who understood that behind every strong face, there was still a child finding her way. To the outside world, it looked like devotion, but it was more than that. Adesua did not just love Ayomide, she depended on her. After losing her husband, something inside her had shifted. The space he once filled did not remain empty. It was replaced, slowly, completely, by her daughter. Ayomide became her focus, her motivation, her reason to keep moving forward. Every decision she made, every success she built, every plan she created was tied to one purpose, her daughter's future. It was not something she questioned. It was not something she balanced. It was everything. And without realizing it, Adesua had done something dangerous. She had placed her entire identity into one life, one person, one future. From the outside, it looked perfect. A powerful woman, a secure home, a promising daughter. Nothing missing, nothing exposed. But the truth is, no amount of wealth can control everything. No level of preparation can stop what you never see coming. And sometimes, the very thing you build your life around becomes the thing you cannot survive losing. So let me ask you, do you think money can truly protect your family? Or does it only give the illusion that it can? Because what happened next did not ask for permission. By the time Ayomide reached this stage of her life, her past did not feel uncertain. It felt planned. not forced, but guided with intention. She had grown into someone who understood expectations without being weighed down by them. Her academic record spoke clearly. Consistent results, strong recommendations, lecturers who mentioned her name with quiet approval whenever conversations turned to promising students. But Ayomide was not defined by grades alone. She carried herself with purpose. There was a clarity in the way she spoke about her future, a confidence that made people listen without interruption. She knew where she was going, and more importantly, she knew why. Applications abroad were already in motion, not rushed, not delayed, handled with precision. Adesua ensured that every document, every requirement, every detail had been addressed early. Conversations at home often circled around possibilities. Which country? Which program? What kind of life she wanted to build? And each time, Ayomide spoke with quiet certainty. I want to do something that matters. It was not about prestige. It was about impact. And for Adesua, hearing that was enough. Because everything she had invested, every sacrifice, every decision was becoming something real. Outside academics, Ayomide moved through her world with ease. People gravitated toward her naturally, not because she demanded attention, but because she made others feel comfortable. Conversations with her never felt forced. She listened as much as she spoke, and when she laughed, it carried a kind of lightness that stayed with people long after the moment passed. Her friends trusted her. They came to her with problems they couldn't explain to anyone else. They valued her honesty, even when it wasn't easy to hear. She had a way of saying things clearly, without making people feel small. In social gatherings, she stood out without trying, not through loud gestures or constant presence, but through quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need validation. And in those spaces, people noticed, not just her personality, but her discipline, her focus, her direction. She was respected, not just liked, but respected. There was also something else beginning to take shape in her life, subtle at first, unspoken. It started with longer phone calls, moments where she would pause mid-conversation with Adesua, her attention briefly pulled elsewhere. A small smile she didn't explain. Messages she would read and respond to with just a little more care. Adesua noticed, not immediately with concern, but with curiosity. One evening, during dinner, she asked lightly, "Is there something you're not telling me?" Ayomide hesitated for a second, then smiled. Maybe. It wasn't a full answer, but it was enough. There was someone, not defined yet, not introduced, but present. And for the first time, Adesua saw her daughter not just as a child she was raising, but as a young woman beginning to build her own world beyond the one she had always known. It was a quiet shift, but it mattered. In the background of all this, another figure remained familiar, Kunle Adeyemi. He was not always present, but he appeared enough times to remain part of their routine. Family gatherings, occasional visits, short conversations that never seemed out of place. He carried himself casually, with the kind of familiarity that comes from long-standing connection. His presence did not raise questions. He was family, someone who had shared space with them before, someone who could walk into their home without explanation. At times, he would exchange brief words with Ayomide, simple, harmless conversations that passed without attention. A greeting here, a question about school there. Nothing that stood out, nothing that seemed worth remembering. And that was exactly why it stayed unnoticed. Because not every danger announces itself. Some things exist quietly, blending into the spaces you trust the most. From every angle, Ayomide's life looked whole. A strong future, genuine connections, a family structure that supported her completely. And at the center of it all, Adesua watched, proud, certain, at peace with what she had built. There was no doubt in her mind. Her daughter would succeed. Her daughter would be safe. Her daughter would live the life she had worked so hard to create for her. That belief was not fragile. It felt solid, unshakable, because nothing in her world had ever suggested otherwise. But the most dangerous moments in life are often the ones that feel the most secure. The times when everything seems aligned, when nothing feels out of place. Because that is when you stop looking for what could go wrong. And in that silence, in that comfort, in that certainty, everything can change without warning. What Adesua did not know, what she could not see, was that the life she had built so carefully was already standing on the edge of something she could never control. The night began without warning. Nothing unusual, nothing that hinted at what was coming. Inside the Ikoyi home, everything was still in place. The lights were soft. The air was calm, the kind of quiet that usually meant the day had ended without complication. Adesua Adeyemi stood in the kitchen, finishing the last details of her evening routine. It was late, but not unfamiliar. She preferred closing her days slowly, making sure everything was in order before she rested. Her phone lay on the counter beside her, silent, until it wasn't. The sound cut through the quiet space sharply, a single ring, then another. Adesua glanced at the screen without urgency, but the moment she saw the unknown number, something shifted. Not fear, not yet, just a pause. She wiped her hands, picked up the phone, and answered. Hello? There was a brief silence on the other end, then a voice. Professional, controlled, too careful. Am I speaking with Mrs. Adesua Adeyemi? Yes. Another pause. And then the words came. Measured, deliberate. Your daughter has been brought in. You need to come to the hospital immediately. No explanation, no details, just urgency. Adesua's grip tightened around the phone. What happened? She asked. But the answer didn't come. Please come as soon as possible. The line went dead. For a moment, she stood still, as if her body hadn't yet caught up with what she had just heard. Then everything moved at once. She grabbed her keys without thinking, her bag, her phone. The house, once calm and controlled, suddenly felt too quiet, too empty. She stepped outside, the night air hitting her sharply as she moved toward her car. The driver was not there. There was no time to call, no time to wait. She got in herself. The engine started on the first turn, but her hands were no longer steady. The smooth control she carried in every other part of her life was gone. The road ahead blurred as she pulled out. Traffic lights, headlights, movement. Everything passed too quickly and not fast enough at the same time. Her mind tried to make sense of it. An accident, maybe? Something minor. It had to be, because anything else didn't fit, didn't belong in her world. She pressed harder on the accelerator. The hospital stood ahead, bright against the darkness. Too bright, too still. Adesua parked without care for alignment, stepping out before the engine fully settled. The air inside felt colder than outside, sharper, filled with a quiet tension that did not need explanation. She approached the front desk. My daughter, she said quickly. Ayomide Adeyemi. I was called. The nurse looked at her. Not confused, not searching, just aware. And that was enough to make something inside Adesua tighten. Please wait, the nurse said softly. Wait. The word didn't sit well. I need to see her, Adesua replied. A second figure appeared. A doctor this time. Calm expression, controlled tone. Mrs. Adeyemi, please come with me. No reassurance, no urgency in his steps, just a steady walk down a corridor that felt longer than it should have. The sound of their footsteps echoed faintly against the walls. Nothing else. No voices, no movement, just silence. They stopped. The doctor turned toward her, and for a brief second, he said nothing. That silence said more than any explanation could. Adesua felt it before she heard it, felt it in the way his eyes shifted, in the way his voice softened before he spoke. "I'm very sorry." The words landed slowly, too slowly. "Your daughter didn't make it." For a moment, Adesua did not react, not because she didn't understand, but because her mind refused to accept it. "No," she said quietly, not loud, not emotional, just firm. "No." The doctor continued, but his voice felt distant now. Something about arrival, something about injuries, but the words lost meaning because one truth had already taken over everything else. Ayomide was gone. It did not end there. It should have, but it didn't. "Mrs. Adeyemi, there's something else you need to know." The words felt heavier this time, more deliberate, more difficult to deliver. Adesua forced herself to look at him, to listen, and what she heard next broke something deeper than grief. There were signs of assault. The sentence hung in the air, unclear for a moment, until it was. Her body went still, completely still. The doctor continued, carefully. She was attacked and then killed. No confusion now, no space for misunderstanding. The truth stood clear, final. Her daughter had not just died. She had been violated, overpowered, and left with nothing. The world around Adesua seemed to lose shape. The walls no longer felt steady. The air no longer felt real. Everything she had built, every layer of control, every measure of protection collapsed in a single moment. Because none of it had mattered. None of it had stopped this. Adesua did not scream. She did not fall. She did not react in the way people expect grief to look. She simply stood there, empty. Because there are moments when pain goes beyond expression, when it becomes too large to release, too heavy to carry, too real to deny. Her hands, once steady in every situation, now hung loosely at her sides. Her voice, once firm and controlled, did not return. For the first time in years, she had nothing. No plan, no control, no answer. Only loss and the quiet, crushing realization that everything she believed could protect her daughter had failed completely. The night outside continued as if nothing had changed. Cars moved, lights stayed on, life continued. But inside that hospital corridor, a world had ended, and Adesua Adeyemi stood at the center of it, with nothing left to hold on to. The kiss did not fade after the funeral. It grew sharper, colder, like a blade being honed in silence. Detective Chukwu refused to let grief cloud the process. Every detail from the crime scene was catalogued with precision. Photographs were re-examined under brighter light. Footprints were measured again. Even the smallest fibers were tested twice. At first, nothing stood out. Then, patterns began to form. The location of the crime wasn't random. It sat along a path Ayomide had taken many times before, one she trusted. There were no signs of forced entry into her routine, no indication she had been dragged far. Whoever did this knew her movements, knew her comfort zones, knew where she would not expect danger. That realization changed everything. This was no longer a search for a stranger. It became a search within her circle. Phone records were the next step. Detective Chukwu's team pulled Ayomide's call logs from the days leading up to her death. Names appeared. Friends, classmates, lecturers, all expected. But one number appeared more frequently than the rest. It wasn't alarming at first. It was family. Uncle Kunle. The calls weren't long, but they were consistent. Late evening check-ins, short conversations, nothing that screamed danger. Still, something felt off. Why so frequent? Why so close to the time everything changed? The detective circled the number on her report. A small mark, a quiet suspicion, the kind that grows. Forensics delivered their next report 2 days later. A partial fingerprint had been recovered from an object near the scene, a metal tool discarded in haste. It wasn't clean, but it was usable. The database search took hours. When the result came back, the room went still. Match found. Kunle Adeyemi. No one spoke immediately. Even the officers exchanging glances seemed reluctant to say it out loud. Family. The word carried weight, heavier than evidence. Detective Chukwu leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on the file. This was no longer a theory. It was a direction. And directions like this didn't just solve cases. They shattered lives. When Adesua was informed, she didn't react the way they expected. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply stared. No, she said quietly. That's not possible. Kunle had been present through everything. After the funeral, he visited. He had sat in her living room. He spoke gently, offering comfort. He had prayed with her. The memory of his voice now felt wrong. Every word replayed in her mind, but this time something shifted. The pauses were longer. The tone felt rehearsed. The concern hollow. Adesua's chest tightened. What if, she whispered, almost afraid to finish the thought. What if the person who mourned with her already knew everything? Memories began to rearrange themselves. Moments that once felt harmless now carried a different weight. Kunle offers to pick Ayomide up from school to help. Kunle insisted she call him when she arrived home safely. Kunle watching just a second too long during family gatherings. At the time, it had seemed like care. Now it felt like an observation. Adesua remembered the night when Ayomide hesitated before answering his call, just for a second. Then she smiled it off. I'll call him back later, she had said. Why later? Why the hesitation? The past didn't change, but the meaning did, and that meaning began to suffocate her. The police brought Kunle in for questioning. He didn't resist. He didn't panic. He sat calmly, almost too calmly as the questions came. Where were you that night? Do you recognize this item? Why were your fingerprints found near the scene? His answers were scattered. Not aggressive, not defensive, just disconnected. I was walking. I don't remember that. Voices were loud that night. Detective Chukwu watched him closely. His gaze drifted, unfocused, as if he were somewhere else entirely, or pretending to be. The line between confusion and performance blurred, but the evidence didn't blur. It stood firm. The final piece came quietly. A neighbor near the scene reported seeing a familiar figure that night. Not clearly, but enough to describe posture, movement, clothing. When shown a photo lineup, the hesitation was brief. The finger pointed. Kunle. That was it. No more gaps. No more speculation. The case locked into place with a heavy finality. When the truth was confirmed, it didn't explode. It settled, like dust after a collapse. The danger had not come from the shadows. It had not followed her daughter through dark streets. It had sat at their table, shared meals, shared laughter, shared trust. Adesua fought alone in her living room that night, staring at the empty chair Kunle once occupied. Her voice broke into silence. What if the danger was sitting at your own table? The question didn't need an answer. She already knew. And that truth was far more terrifying than anything she had imagined. The trial did not begin quietly. By sunrise, the courthouse steps were already crowded. Journalists lined the entrance, cameras raised, voices competing for attention. Microphones carried fragments of speculation into the morning air. A family member accused, a shocking turn in the case, questions about safety within trusted circles. Inside, the atmosphere was heavier. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Strangers leaned forward with curiosity. Relatives sat rigid, eyes fixed ahead. The case had moved beyond private grief. It had become a public spectacle. Adesua walked in slowly, her expression controlled, but her steps carried weight. She could feel the eyes on her, measuring her pain, turning it into a story. At the front, Kunle sat behind the defense table. He did not look at her. The prosecution wasted no time. Each piece of evidence was introduced with precision. Photographs from the scene, recovered items linked to the struggle, forensic analysis placing Kunle at the location, call records establishing repeated contact. The courtroom listened in silence as the narrative formed, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just steady and deliberate. A timeline emerged, a pattern, a connection that could not be easily dismissed. Witnesses were called one by one. A passerby described a figure fleeing. A forensic analyst explained the match in careful detail. Each voice added weight. Adesua sat still through it all, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Every word felt like a confirmation. Every detail a step closer to something she could not yet name. When the defense rose, the tone changed. There was no attempt to deny the presence of evidence, no effort to dismantle the timeline. Instead, the strategy moved in a different direction: responsibility, control, state of mind. The defense attorney spoke calmly, almost gently as he addressed the court. This is not a case of denial. It is a case of understanding. A pause followed. Then the argument unfolded. Kunle had not acted with awareness. On that night, something had broken within him, something that removed judgment, something that replaced reality with distortion. The word was introduced carefully: temporary insanity. It settled into the courtroom like a quiet disturbance. An expert witness took the stand, a psychiatrist. Measured voice, controlled tone. He described episodes of disconnection, moments where perception and reality no longer aligned. He explained how a person could act without full awareness, driven by internal chaos rather than intention. The explanation was clinical, detached, but its implications were enormous. If an individual cannot understand their actions, can they be held fully responsible for them? The question lingered. No one answered, but everyone felt it. When Kunle was called to testify, the room tightened. He walked slowly to the stand, his movements uncertain. For the first time, he looked towards Adesua, only briefly. Then his gaze dropped. His voice, when it came, was uneven. I don't remember everything. That night, it wasn't clear. He spoke of confusion, of sounds that didn't make sense, of moments that felt disconnected from reality. I thought I was stopping something, he added quietly. The statement hung in the air. Not an explanation, not an apology, just something incomplete. Adesua felt her breath catch. Not from belief, but from the weight of hearing him speak at all. The courtroom held its breath as the judge prepared to speak. No movement, no whispers, only silence. The words came slowly, each one landing with force. After reviewing the evidence and the arguments presented, a pause.
This court finds the defendant not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. For a moment, nothing happened. Then everything did. Voices broke the silence instantly. Gasps, shouts, arguments rising from every corner. Some protested loudly, disbelief clear in every word. Others shook their heads, stunned into quiet frustration. The tension that had built throughout the trial released all at once. Outside, the reaction spread just as quickly. Reporters rushed to deliver updates. Headlines formed in real time. Public opinion is divided sharply. Was this justice? Or was it something else entirely? Inside, the judge called for order, but the noise refused to settle easily. The decision had been made, but acceptance did not follow. Adesua did not join the noise. She remained seated, still, unmoving. The words echoed in her mind, repeating without change. Not guilty. Not guilty. Not guilty. They felt unreal, detached from everything she had heard, everything she had endured. Her hands loosened slowly, the tension draining not into relief, but into something emptier. She looked toward the front of the courtroom, but her focus had already shifted inward. This was the moment she had waited for, and it had given her nothing. No closure, no balance, no sense that anything had been made right. Something inside her gave way, but quietly. No tears, no outburst, just a silent collapse that no one else could see. As the courtroom cleared and the noise faded into distant echoes, one question remained, unanswered, unresolved, unavoidable. What had just happened? A verdict had been delivered. A decision had been justified. But the outcome left a fracture that words could not repair. Justice in that moment did not feel complete. It felt uncertain, unstable, and deeply contested. Adesua walked out without speaking, her silence carrying more weight than any reaction. Behind her, the case would continue to be discussed, debated, and analyzed. But for her, the question was no longer theoretical. It was personal, and it would not leave her. Be honest. Do you think this was justice or failure? Comment below. The office was quiet when Adesua arrived. No cameras, no crowd, no whispers trailing behind her. Just a closed door and a man who already understood more than he wanted to. Her lawyer looked up as she entered, immediately sensing the shift. This was not the same woman who had sat across from him during the trial. Something had settled inside her. Not grief, not confusion. Something colder. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she stood there for a moment, as if measuring the weight of what she was about to say. Then she spoke. I know what I'm going to do. He gestured for her to sit, concerned with tightening his expression. Adesua, whatever you're thinking, I'm going to kill him. The words were calm, too calm. They didn't rise in anger or fall in doubt. They landed exactly where she intended them to. Her lawyer froze. For a moment, he searched her face, hoping to find hesitation, fear, anything that suggested this was emotion speaking. But there was none. He walked free, she continued, because the system allowed him to say he didn't understand what he was doing. Her gaze didn't break. So, I'll do the same. Silence filled the room. You can't be serious, he said finally, his voice lower now. I am. She stepped closer, her voice steady. They already showed me how it works, she said. He claimed he wasn't in control, and they accepted it. Her lawyer shook his head. That's not how this works. I'm talking about using the same rules. The statement wasn't emotional. It was logical, calculated. If the law can excuse him, then it can hear me too. He exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face. This won't bring her back. I know that. Then what does it give you? Adesua paused, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was simple. Balance. The days that followed were quiet. No announcements, no visible changes. But beneath that stillness, everything shifted. Adesua began to observe, not randomly, not carelessly. She learned his movements the way someone studies a pattern they intend to break. When he left, where he went, how long he stayed. There was no rush, no urgency, only patience. She adjusted her routine, creating distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. Fewer interactions, fewer explanations. Every decision narrowed her focus. Every thought pointed forward. The rain started before she left. Soft at first, then steady. By the time she reached her destination, the streets were nearly empty. The sound of water hitting pavement filled the silence, masking everything else. He was there, exactly where she expected him to be, standing under partial cover, unaware. For a moment, she watched him, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with recognition. This was the man who had sat in her home, who spoke softly, who had been trusted without question. That version of him no longer existed. She stepped forward. The sound of her movement was swallowed by the rain. He turned too late. Recognition flashed across his face, brief, incomplete. Adesua. That was all he managed to say. The distance between them closed in an instant. There was no struggle that lasted, no drawn-out moment of uncertainty. Only action. Deliberate, focused, controlled. The rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, as everything ended. When it was over, she stepped back. Her breathing remained even, her hands steady. There was no loss of control in her movements, no loss of uncertainty. Only the completion of something she had already decided long before this moment. She did not run. She did not hide. Instead, she stood there for a moment, letting the reality settle, not as shock, but as confirmation. Then she turned and walked away, each step measured, each breath steady. There was nothing left to chase, nothing left to confront. The system had spoken once. She had answered. By the time the authorities would piece everything together, she already knew what came next. Another courtroom, another argument, another explanation built on the same foundation that had already been accepted. But this time, she would stand on the other side, not as the one seeking justice, but the one who took it. And the question would return, louder than before, heavier than ever. Not just for the court, but for everyone watching. There are moments that divide everything into before and after. This was one of them. Adesua had crossed a line that could not be undone. Not out of impulse, not out of confusion, but with full awareness of what it meant. And that made it harder to define, harder to judge. Because this was not just about an action. It was about a response, a reaction to a system that had already made its decision. As the rain faded and the night moved on, one question remained, unanswered, unresolved. Is she wrong, or is she doing what the system failed to do? The courtroom filled once again, but this time the focus had shifted. No longer the grieving mother seated in silence. Now Adesua stood at the center, the defendant. The same walls, the same structure, the same attention from the public. Cameras returned, voices outside carried speculation, curiosity, judgment. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. Not because the case was unclear, but because it was not. Everyone already knew what had happened, and more importantly, she did not intend to deny it. When her name was called, she rose without hesitation. No trembling hands, no lowered gaze, only stillness. The prosecutor began outlining the case, but it barely mattered. The evidence was direct, the sequence of events was already established. Then came her moment. She stepped forward. "I did it," she said. No resistance, no delay. The words moved through the courtroom with quiet force. A murmur followed, brief but intense, before fading again. "I knew what I was doing, and I chose to do it." There was no performance in her voice, no attempt to soften the truth. She offered it exactly as it was. Her lawyer stood slowly. There was no surprise in his expression. This had been expected. Prepared. He addressed the court with measured control, carefully building his argument, not around denial, but around state of mind. He spoke of trauma, of sustained emotional strain, of a breaking point shaped by loss and reinforced by what had already unfolded in that same courtroom. Then he introduced the argument, not new, not unfamiliar, temporary insanity. The same foundation, the same reasoning, presented once again but from the opposite side. The courtroom understood immediately. This was not just a defense, it was a reflection, a mirror held up to the system itself. If one case had been judged through that lens, how could another be treated differently under similar claims? The question did not need to be spoken directly. It existed in the structure of the argument, in the silence that followed, in the recognition that this moment was shaped by a decision already made in the past. The law was now facing its own consistency. When the judge prepared to speak, the room settled into stillness. There was no anticipation of surprise, only a quiet tension built on inevitability. The words came with formal clarity. After reviewing the facts and arguments presented, a pause. This court finds the defendant not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. No explosion followed this time, no sudden eruption, only a deep collective stillness. Because everyone understood what it meant. The system had answered itself. Adesua did not react, no visible shift, no release of tension. She simply stood there absorbing the outcome. She was free, by law, by decision, by the same reasoning that had once denied her closure. But freedom did not feel like victory. It did not restore anything. It did not return what had been lost. It only confirmed that the process had reached an end. And yet, something remained unresolved. Days later, she stood before a familiar place, quiet, undisturbed, her daughter's grave. The world moved as it always had, distant sounds, passing voices, life continuing beyond that space. But here, everything felt still. She knelt slowly, placing her hand against the stone. "I did what I thought I had to," she whispered. The words carried no pride, no justification, only acknowledgement. The wind moved softly around her, but there was no response, no change, no sign that anything had been repaired. For a long moment she remained there, then the truth settled in. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly. Revenge had not healed her. It had not restored peace. It had not filled the absence left behind. The pain remained, unchanged. What she had done had answered a question of action, but not a question of loss. The system functioned as it was designed to. It followed its own rules, applied its own reasoning, reached conclusions that aligned with its structure. And yet, something about it felt incomplete. not broken in appearance, but fragile in impact, because the outcome did not erase suffering, it only processed it. Power, law, control, none of it had protected her from what matters most. Some stories do not end with resolution, they end with understanding. That justice does not always feel like justice. That pain does not disappear simply because a decision is made. That strength, action, and even control cannot undo loss. Adesua stood slowly, taking a last look before turning away. Not because she had moved on, but because there was nowhere else to go. If this story touched you, share it, because stories like this need to be heard, and don't forget to tell us where you are chatting from in the comment.